Hi, it's Charles McCall again, and I'm still here in Kampong Cham City, still sitting in the same seat that I was sitting in when I gave you the last meditational thought, and I've just moved maybe one verse down. I want to share with you when Paul's talking about heresy and urging Timothy to be proactive in addressing false teaching in the local church there. In Ephesus, I believe, is where he told him to stay. And then he starts talking about the law. He said, from some, speaking about now the purpose of the commandment is love from a pure heart, from a good conscience, and a sincere faith, from which some, having strayed, having turned aside to idle talk, desiring to be teachers of the law, understanding neither what they say nor the things which they affirm. And then Paul goes on to talk about the law. We're talking about the law in the Bible. Most of the time we're talking about what we call the moral law. There's three different different sets of laws that are referred to in the Bible that come from God. And one is the moral law. We call that the 10 Commandments. And so the moral law reveals God's character. The moral law was established for Jews in the Old Testament, God's people, but it represents the character of God, of who He is. And we will discover that each one of those 10 Commandments, each one of those moral laws, are reestablished in the New Testament. What we say is the cross is the great hermeneutical filter. How do you know what's true for the Old Testament and what's also true for the New Testament? And one of my mentors, Kevin Connor, would say, whatever passes through the cross and is reestablished in the New Testament is for New Testament believers, Christians, us. But whatever truth, Old Testament truth, that comes to the cross and does not pass through and is not reestablished in the New Testament is not something that is applicable to us New Testament believers, but it was for those living under the Old Covenant, New Covenant and Old Covenant. And so the 10 Commandments, all of the 10 Commandments except for one, can be found reestablished in the New Testament. And so they pass through the cross. The one that is not reestablished in the New Testament is the 4th commandment, keep the Sabbath. And so don't worship false gods, don't bow down to idols, don't commit adultery, don't covet, don't lie, don't steal, don't do all of these things. You can find those Bible verses reestablished and reaffirmed in the New Testament. There's something that are applicable for us to follow because they represent the moral character of God. But the 4th commandment, keep the Sabbath, is changed. It comes through in a spiritual context. Is that we don't keep a specific day. As Christians, we don't keep a specific day. You can't find that. You can find it in the Gospels because the Gospels were still living under the Old Covenant. The New Covenant was established after the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so, yes, you can find Jesus observing the Sabbath, and you find the Jews observing the Sabbath. But after that, you don't find any of the New Covenant believers observing the Sabbath because the Sabbath is the one commandment that has not been reestablished in the New Testament. However, we see it in Hebrews chapter 4 in a spiritual sense. And so the Sabbath is a spiritual Sabbath. Sabbath means rest. And so the Jews were commanded to physically rest one day a week. We say that there's a Sabbath principle. I think it's a great day to take a day off once a week. A great opportunity. It's not a great principle, a great idea to take one day off a week, but it's not a law. You're not going to get stoned for it. You're going to get killed for it. You're not going to get put in prison for it or fined for it if you don't take a day off. But it sure is a good idea to do that. God set that principle. But for us New Testament believers, the Sabbath is a continual rest. We enter into a spiritual rest that affects our spirit, our soul, and our body in Jesus Christ. Hebrews chapter 4 explains the spiritual aspect of the Sabbath. And so regarding the law, that there's the moral law, as I said, and then there is the social law that God made for Israel. The social law has to do with paying fines and about what happens to a thief and relationships between society. And so these are social laws that God has established for Israel. Again, many of them are very good ideas. If you look in the New Testament, you study the New Testament and see which social laws are reaffirmed for us Christians. Now again, many of them in the Old Testament are good principles, good ideas that we can follow, but they're not a law like they were in the Old Testament for the Old Covenant believers. And so you have the moral law, which all but one are reaffirmed in the New Testament. You have the social law. Some of them are reaffirmed in the New Testament, but not all of them. And then you have the ceremonial law. The ceremonial law has to do with ways of worship and sacrifice and feast days and holy days. Those are not reestablished in the New Testament. And so we say the cross is the great hermeneutical filter, or the cross is the filter. And so whatever passes through the cross and is reestablished in the New Testament, particularly from the book of Acts onward to the book of Revelation, then we say this is new covenant way of life for new covenant believers. And so this is general guidelines on the law, the moral law, the social law, and the ceremonial law. Which one of them pass through the cross and are reestablished as principles to live by, practices to follow by new covenant believers, and which ones are not.